Um, Welcome to the 7th meeting of 2020 of Carroll PMC's, or Carroll College Pre-Medical Club. Today we have a really special guest who's going to explain to us a little bit about MD PhD, which is something that I think we brought up at some meetings. We've alluded to a little bit by virtue of some of our officials' interests. However, we haven't really delved really deep into it. And today we have a great guest speaker for you guys to really allow us to do so. So today's agenda, as usual, is going to be some opening messages, and then a COVID-19 case report, as usual. Then we'll have our speaker give his presentation, which will take about 25 to 30, maybe 35 minutes. And then we're just going to open it up for questions. And the last couple of times we've had guest speakers on, we followed a similar pattern of leave it up to the speaker, but in all reality, usually save questions until the end, or just type them into the chat. So if you wouldn't mind muting all of your speakers, your microphones, and then let our speaker talk and hear his preferences as well at the beginning about whether or not he minds being interrupted. And then, feel free to take the floor and answer as many questions as you'd like, or ask as many questions as you'd like. Then we'll tell you a little bit about our next meeting, and then we'll finish with some closing remarks.
Yeah, and so as we like to open every meeting, we have the model of informing, exciting, empowering, and involving each and every one of you guys. This meeting in particular, as we empower you and want to involve all of you to ask these questions you might have about MD, PhD, and the dual degree, and kind of setting the tone of the meeting. Two questions I think that are important to keep in mind are, why am I here and why should I care? These are really important questions that you should be able to answer during our meeting and after our meeting today, because I truly believe there's going to be great information that will be shared. And for the next slide, for the COVID community update, since our last meeting, there's been a total case increase from 100,000 to 102,000 in the state of Montana. And currently county numbers have increased in Lewis and Clark County by 106. Total deaths increased in Montana by 34, with one unfortunately being reported from Lewis and Clark County. And other important information, there is an update on the Carroll PMC club shirts. They are underway, and we have been in communication with a provider that would be able to organize that for us, and we can get that to members in the future. And then quickly in the next slide, just to cover, there has been updates in Lewis and Clark County. And an important update is that the face mandates are still, face masks are still required, but what has been changed is the other restrictions have been lifted, and that is the event capacities and the hours of operation and capacity limits. If you are interested in either vaccine updates or any other information, the Lewis and Clark County COVID-19 hub, which the link is provided above, or it's really easy to access if you look up online, is a great resource to learn more about what's going on in the county.
And one last little thing prior to getting to our speaker. The University of Washington School of Medicine is holding virtual advice sessions for reapplicants. So this is really, it's a webinar that's intended for people who applied to UW and did not get in. So the date and time is on the bottom of the screen, as is a little barcode. So if you'd like to scan that, you can scan that now, and it'll give you a little bit of information about signing up for it. But in all honesty, you can Google this, and you can access it. That is something that you are interested in. So without further ado.
Andrew, do you mind? I apologize. I just have a brief word, and then you can introduce the good doctor. So Wes and I were talking, and we just found out that Carroll College has a formal relationship with a couple of medical schools. So what that means is that for qualified applicants, so if you get all the prereqs, if you hit them MCAT score and you get the GPA, you will get an automatic interview. So these are the 3 schools that we have a formal relationship with. If you want to write it down, that's great. I'll send it out to Andrew as well, and he can pass it along. It's Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine, the University of Incarnate Word, which is in San Antonio, Texas, and Pacific Northwest University. So that's a really great thing if you want to think about when you apply to medical schools. It's like those 3 colleges, if you hit those prereqs, you'll get an automatic interview. Just I want to throw that out there.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. And with that, we will now introduce our speaker to you guys today. So welcome, Dr. Martin. And I know you have a slide. So at this point, I'm going to stop screen sharing and let me know if you can get your slide up.
Okay, I will do that in just a second, but since you mentioned these, what we call articulation agreements, I just want to say a few words about admissions to WWAMI, since I'm the director of the WWAMI program. I'm not involved in the admissions process directly. I do get to meet the students that interview, but I have no role in the selection of the candidates. But I can tell you that we get about 100+ applications every year, and we interview about 75 of the applicants. So even though we do not guarantee everyone an interview just because they apply, we do interview the vast majority of students who apply. And I think if you look at the metrics that are required for some of those other articulation agreements, we probably interview pretty much all the people who satisfy those as well. So I would encourage you to apply to WWAMI. It is by far the best deal for Montana residents in terms of the cost of medical school. Plus, you get to go to one of the top 10 medical schools in the country, which is a rare privilege. So having said that, I've been the WWAMI director for the last 12 years, and every 2 years we hold a pre-med summit in the fall. This next one is going to be actually held at Carroll College. I don't know if you've been told about that. But for those of you who are applying this cycle, this year, that of course is too late to be getting advice because your applications should be in by then. It's a good idea to get your application in, your AMCAS at least, by the end of summer. And then the absolute latest deadline for getting the secondary and the residency certification and everything else in will be in October. Okay, so I was asked to talk about MD PhD students, and at these pre-med summits for the last 12 years, I have talked about that. And full disclosure, I'm not an MD PhD. I'm a PhD. But I have known a lot of MD PhDs, and I have been teaching at 2 different medical schools, one of them being Cornell Medical School in New York City, and then at the WWAMI program here in Montana. Okay, so, and both of those schools have MD PhD programs. So now I'm going to share my screen, and if you do put questions into the chat, I will try to monitor that. Let's see if I can get this to. Here you go.
I'll monitor it as well. I'll keep an eye on it too. And guys, like having known this now about our speaker, about being the program director of WWAMI, I encourage you guys to ask any questions about that as well, if there are none related to MD, PhD that you have.
Okay. Actually, here now that I'm looking at my controls, I'm not sure I can actually, oh yeah, let's see. No, I can't actually see the chat while I'm sharing slides. So you will have to tell me if there are questions there.
Do you mind being interrupted?
No, I do not mind at all. This
Okay.
is for your benefit. I don't mind being interrupted.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so why do both an MD and a PhD? And here's some reasons. You may want to combine research and patient care. And that's what a lot of MD PhDs will do. You don't absolutely have to have a PhD in order to do clinical research. There are quite a few MDs who do clinical research who don't have a PhD, but the PhD training will help because that kind of training also teaches you all about the process of getting grant funding and how translational research works. But the main reason, I think, is that you want to graduate without going into debt. Most MD PhD programs provide full tuition waivers and stipends. So you're actually being paid while going to medical school instead of paying an arm and a leg. Okay. Let's see, why isn't this advancing? There you go. So how do you get into an MD PhD program? It's highly competitive, right? A lot of schools have these programs, but each reserves only a few positions for MD PhDs in their MD class, typically less than 5%. As we'll see in a minute, University of Washington has 10 slots for MD PhDs out of a total class size of 270. You have to have stellar MCAT scores and GPA and preferably a lot of undergraduate research experience. And we'll talk about that a little more later, but most of these MD PhD programs are nationally competitive. So when you're looking at, let's say, University of Washington, where admission is generally restricted to students from one of the 5 WWAMI states, and there's a certain number allotted to each state, and 30 of those are from Montana. As I mentioned before, we get about 100 and so applicants. So your odds of getting in are 30 over 100, which is actually not bad, if you're looking at the MD PhD program, it's nationally competitive. There's hundreds of students who apply, and then they only accept 10. So that's why it becomes so competitive. It starts with the same application process, the AMCAS, and then you indicate that you have an MD PhD preference. And then the secondary will ask you for additional information relevant to the MD PhD program. And some schools have separate interviews for MD and PhD. Some do it together. A lot of the schools provide travel funds for interviewing. And you have to be admitted to both the MD and the PhD program. Usually the MD program is harder to get into for those schools that do the admissions separately. So I've known a fair number of students who got into the PhD program at a school, but not into the MD PhD program. And then they had to choose, do I want to get a PhD or do I want to, just go for an MD? So how does it work? So typically, the first 2 years of medical school, a basic science curriculum, as they call it, is the same for the MDs and the MD PhDs. However, there's a few things added in. That is rotations in research labs. Those rotations will help you identify what you want to do for your PhD project, which lab you might want to work with. And those rotations may start even in the summer before you matriculate into medical school. There's going to be more rotations in the summer between first and second year. And by the end of the second year, or in some programs where the foundation or basic science phase is less than 2 years long, whenever that ends, then you have to choose a research advisor and project. And then instead of going into your clinical rotations, like the other MD students, you work on your research and your PhD first. And that can take 3 or 4 years. There is no set time that it takes to get a PhD. It's very dependent on how successful your project is. And so there's a lot of uncertainty involved in just how long that takes. This 3 to 4 years is an average. So after you've completed your PhD research, then you go back to a medical school essentially and do the last 2 years, which is the required and elective clinical rotations, step 2 of the board exam, and you figure out what specialty you want to go into and apply for residencies and interview for those and go into what they call the match, just like all the other MD students. Then, like all medical students, once you graduate, you still have to do a residency in order to be allowed to practice. Residencies can take 3 to 5 years, depending on the specialty. And then MD PhDs typically do a 1 to 2 year fellowship after residency that includes a research project. This is kind of like the postdoctoral fellowship that PhDs generally do before they get a real job, like a faculty job or something like that. The difference is that the MD PhDs get paid a lot more in their fellowships than the PhDs do. And we can come back to that later. Now, MSTP is a particular name for a training program funded by an NIH grant, Medical Sciences Training Program. There are 200 of these around the country, and all of the top 20 medical schools have an MSTP program. Because the whole process is funded by a federal grant, the feds make the rules, and the rules are they have to take residents from all 50 states, no in-state preference. They provide a stipend, plus all the tuition, travel, supplies, and so on. It's a really great deal financially. Not all MD PhD programs are MSTPs. There are some that medical schools that have set up their own MD PhD programs but don't have one of these grants. And at those, you have to look very carefully to see, how much financial support are you going to get, because it will vary. All right, so here's an example. The one that I know the most about is the UW program. It is an MSTP. They take 10 students per year out of 500 applicants from all over the country. Okay, so odds are 50 to 1 instead of 3 to 1. They have an MSTP application that you have to fill out after you do your AMCAS and hear back from them. And there's a single interview process by an MSTP committee that includes representatives of both the grad school and the med school. Stipends start at $28,000 and increase to $32,000. And you get tuition waivers, health insurance, and a lot of benefits. And there's a huge choice of research areas. There's a whole list of departments there that I'm not gonna read through, but basically you have hundreds of research labs to choose from to do the MD PhD. Now, all of these are going to be in Seattle. These 10 MD PhD students, even if they are from Montana originally do not count as one of the 30 slots that the WWAMI program has for Montana residents. They count towards these 10. And because it is assumed that the research is going to be done in Seattle, and of course the grant that goes to UW in Seattle is what's paying all of this, all those students start medical school in Seattle with the Seattle class. And that includes doing research rotations before med school even starts and in the summer between first and second year. Okay. Now, so that summer first lab rotation, then the first year of medical school is pretty much like the medical students take, except there's additional courses on genome dissection and translational research that the MD students don't have to take. And then after year one, another lab rotation. Then you go to year two. The fall semester is again just like medical school. And just like the MD students, in January, you study for and take the step one of your board exams. And then right when in March, at the end of March, which is coming up very closely now for our second year students, when the MD students go out on clinical clerkship rotations, the PhD students begin working full-time on their research. Okay. Years 3 to 6 then are PhD research. It varies quite a bit. And then when they finish, whenever that is, they go back and do 2 years of medical school clinical rotations. Typical time in the program is 8 years, although it's theoretically possible to do it in 6. 8 is more common, 7 or 8. Okay, so that is what I had for the presentation. So there's an email address for contacting the MSTP program. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can also see the chat and let you start asking questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. That was very informative. So guys, we're going to open it up. I of course have a few questions, but I'll open it up at first. So if any other members or anything would like to ask any questions, just unmute yourself, or you could type in the chat as well. Feel free to do so now.
How heavy do you believe a undergraduate should emphasize their research experience in, let's say, either their personal statement or their work experiences when balancing that with medicine for the MD PhD program?
Okay, well, the med school, and this includes the MD PhD program, has some requirements, some of which are spelled out, like, you know, minimum 40 hours of shadowing physicians and so on. And then there's a not quite so well-defined requirement that you have spent some time in a healthcare job, either volunteer or paid, to help you understand the US healthcare systems and all its wonders and foibles. For the MD program, research is not required, and because the Montana WWAMI program in particular is very much interested in training MDs who come back to Montana to practice, the reality is that there's not a whole lot of opportunities for clinical research in Montana, or, you know, the kind of work that MD PhDs might be doing. So emphasizing the research experience doesn't really help as far as being admitted to WWAMI. Now, if you're applying to the MD PhD program, which is evaluated by a completely different committee that includes a bunch of research scientists, they are going to be very, very interested in what you did for your research project and what motivates you to want to get an MD PhD. Because to be honest, I've spent most of my career doing research. It's not easy. It has its ups and downs and its frustrations. And the whole reason that these programs exist and are largely funded by the federal government is that not that many physicians choose to pursue a career in research as opposed to just a patient care. And there's no financial advantage to doing research. And therefore, they need to make it attractive. And the attraction is, of course, that you go to medical school for free, get a stipend, and there are lots of jobs out there for MD PhDs in academic institutions and medical schools and the such. But you'll still not make as much money as somebody who, let's say, spends all day as an orthopedic surgeon. There's just no way. So the committee is going to be very interested in why is it that you're going to choose to do this research thing. And the more experience you've had in undergraduate research and the more you can talk about that with enthusiasm, the better it is as far as getting into an MD PhD program. So it counts for a lot there, not so much in the MD program.
Great, thank you so much.
So having that be said, now I was going to save this question for the end, in all honesty, but just what you said on that last response, I think it'd be a good time to say so. So given the fact that you know a lot of MD PhDs, and I'm assuming then you probably know a fair amount of MDs probably as well, and you've probably gained a sense of what it means to be a doctor and what really good doctors, what characteristics they have. And so acknowledging the education that an MD PhD takes on, plus the cost benefit analysis of, okay, like it's not going to make you the most money, but it is going to give you this, maybe help develop you into a more inquisitive doctor, gain some more inquiry. If you were in our positions as a pre-med and wanted to become the most optimal doctor possible, would you take on an MD PhD program? Do you think that there needs to be that a good physician would be one that's pursue an MD PhD pathway, or would, given what you know, would you just choose to go MD? What do you think?
Well, it very much depends on the individual. So for me personally, I would be bored to tears if I were, let's say, working as a surgeon doing the same kind of operation every day.
I feel you.
Hundreds of times over, or seeing patients with the same chronic diseases every day. And research to me is exciting. It's a chance to discover new things, to keep learning and growing constantly throughout your career. And but I've known plenty of students. I mean, I've had about 60 undergraduates working in my research lab over the years. And I would say, about 24 of them have gone on to medical school. And of those, when I look at them, many of them, I hate to say this, decided after doing research for a year or two as an undergrad that that's not what they wanted to spend their life doing. And I often got the comment that you work way too hard. But of course, they don't realize that a lot of physicians work really, really hard too. But it's, that motivation to be a part of discovery and the cutting edge of science has to be pretty strong in order to make it worthwhile. And I wouldn't do it just because I want to go to medical school for free. If you look at, let's say, your typical MD, PhD in academics, even at a medical school, over the course of a career, somebody who specializes as a radiologist or a surgeon or whatever will make 2 or 3 times more money than what it cost them to go to medical school that they would have gotten for free if they went the MD, PhD route. So, don't do it for that reason alone. And as far as what makes a good doctor, is very complicated. One aspect of it is the knowledge, of course, and the desire and ability to keep learning during your many years of practice, because over the years, what you learned in medical school will often turn out to be incorrect, or there's new knowledge that comes out that is better than what was known before. And physicians are required to keep abreast of that to some degree, in that, every 10 years or so, they might have to pass a test that they need to study for, or they have a certain number of continuing medical education credits that they need to do. But the really good physicians are the ones who don't consider that a chore, who actually want to keep learning. And so that's the one aspect of it. But you don't need to have an MD, PhD to do that. It's learning new things is something you have to allot a certain amount of time for. You can't do it if you're spending 10 hours a day doing surgeries or something. But it's not the same thing as actually immersing yourself in research. And the typical MD, PhDs in an academic medical center probably spend about half their time doing research. So it's a significant time commitment, sometimes more than half their time. At Cornell, I knew some MD, PhDs who basically practiced medicine 1 day a week, and the rest of the time they were doing their research. That's quite common. So that's taking it to a whole nother level than just trying to keep educating yourself on new developments. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does, yeah. And so another question along somewhat of the same wavelength. So regarding specialization, so I mean, a lot of us have some interest in some specialties right now. I mean, just looking at my screen right now, Taylor's interested in emergency medicine. Roman, I think, has an interest in family medicine. Peyton's spoken to me about ophthalmology before. Kayla's interested in OBGYN. Michael's interested in surgery. I'm interested in emergency medicine. So we all got some ideas about some specialties that we're interested in. And while knowing the fact that, hey, research probably happens in every specialty, are there any specialties in which it's it might be quite valuable, or the research is really booming in those fields right now, that maybe I should consider looking at an MD PhD more so than if I was interested in another specialty? Or do you think it's just the opportunities are just in all specialties?
Well, there's more opportunities in some fields than others. You know, I know one WWAMI graduate who decided to go into dermatology, and you usually think of dermatologists as, you know, people who, you know, look at skin spots and give Botox injections.
Right. You dry it if it's wet, and you wet it if it's dry. I think that's the.
But she, in fact, does research at the University of Utah, you know, and she's in an academic medical center, and so you can do that in any medical field. Typically, if it's, you know, clinical research, especially. The most research-intensive fields, specialties, I would say, are oncology and pathology, things like that. You know, in oncology in particular, there's just tons of new developments happening all the time, and most oncologists really want to be on top of that, and then they get really interested in getting involved in that research. You know, in family medicine, you would see very little research, but there's clinical research that goes on in family medicine as well. So the other thing you want to keep in mind is that the majority, at least half, probably a majority of medical students change their minds about what specialty they want to go into between when they get admitted to medical school and when they have finished their required rotations in the third year. You know, and unless you're, you know, one of your parents is a physician and you've seen a lot of what they do, then you really have no idea what all these different specialties are like until you've actually experienced some of it in your clinical rotations. And so you want to keep an open mind about what you might want to go into.
Sure.
By the way, Roman, I've got to take a wild guess here, is that you're related to the Roman Hendrickson who used to be president of the MMA?
Yes, I am. I'm his son.
Yeah, and so he was a family physician. So if you want to follow in his footsteps, you have some idea of what you might be getting into. But most medical students really don't know what they like until they've actually experienced it in their clinical rotations.
Yeah, I get a pretty good idea of it. I work beneath him a lot of days. I am often compared to him when I'm working with his patients. I've had patients actually tell him that he needs to start taking lessons from me in bedside manner, which is very surprising. But yeah, living with a physician definitely gives you a very behind the curtain view of what a doctor's life is like.
Right. And so that's one thing I didn't answer to Andrew's question about what makes a great physician. Bedside manner is important. And it's more important than in some fields than others. Obviously, if you're an anesthesiologist or a radiologist and you know, you never really talk to any patients, then that's not important. But for most physicians, that's an important part of it. If you are the kind of person who is not good at interacting with patients, in an MD, PhD, academic medical center type of environment where you become like the world's experts on something, your patients are going to care less about, I mean, when I say care less, I mean, they're not going to care as much about your bedside manner as what do you know. And so, you know, once again, what makes a good physician depends a lot on what that person's role is.
That was well said. Does anyone else have any other questions right now?
Could you speak on the unique opportunity MD PhDs have on, I guess I've heard you say this before, double dipping in grants and funding?
Yeah, so, you know, research requires funding. It's expensive. And somebody has to pay for it. And typically that's federal government funding, although there are, you know, quite a few nonprofit organizations that fund a lot of research in medicine as well. You know, the Cancer Society, the Heart Association, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and so on, fund a lot of research. Now, where was I going with this? The process of applying for grants and getting funding is not for the faint of heart, because it's competitive and maybe only 1 in 5 grant proposals gets funded. And so you have to be willing to, you need more than just good ideas. You need to be able to articulate them well on paper, and you need to be willing to take feedback when your grant is rejected and improve it and try again, because chances are it won't get funded the first time. And so it requires a certain amount of persistence. And in the MD PhD training, when you're doing your research, you get to see that a lot. Your mentor and the other people that you work with will be part of that process constantly. You know, there's never a time as a researcher when you're not thinking about where the next grant is coming from. And that is very useful when you then actually end up writing your own grants, to have read and understood and helped revise the grant proposals for the work that you're doing, and so on. And then it gives you an advantage over, let's say, somebody who's not had that training, who went through medical school, and maybe once they're in residency and so on decides, you know, I want to do research as well as see patients, and which is great, but it requires money. So if you're totally new to that process, it's going to be harder to get going. And in some cases, it's too easy to give up, because if you're an MD and you write a grant proposal to do some research, which might be a great idea, but it gets critiqued rather harshly, and they always do, even if they're good, and then you get frustrated, then you might say to yourself, oh, what the heck, you know, I'll just go back to seeing patients full time. I can't do this as a sideline. But if you're an MD PhD and you are more dedicated to doing this, and you have the dedicated time, and that your position doesn't require you to be practicing every day, then you're going to have the patience and the stamina to keep at it until you do get the funding. And so MD PhDs tend to be more successful in getting grants and getting research projects off the ground than MDs do. Doesn't mean you can't do it as an MD, but certainly the MD PhDs have an advantage. And of course, they have an advantage over the PhDs as well, particularly if the research they want to do is clinical, involves human subjects and so on, but also financially. You know, when I was at Cornell, I had this position where I worked with a number of MD PhDs, and they were assistant professors just like I was. But because they spent 1 day a week seeing patients, their salary was double what mine was. Okay, so even at that stage, and even before that, when you're doing a fellowship, typically fellowships are paid for by federal government grants, and they have a set salary scale. But that salary scale takes a jump after the first 2 years. So if you have a PhD and you get a postdoctoral fellowship, it might pay you, I don't know what it is these days. In my day, it was a lot less, but let's say it pays $35,000 a year to start with. Well, after 2 years, it jumps up to like 60,000 or 70,000. And the MD PhDs, because they've already done a residency that takes at least 3 years, when they go into a fellowship, they're already at that higher pay scale. So they get paid 70 grand from day one. All right, so the whole system is designed to reward the MDs and MD PhDs more for the research work that they're actually doing in academic medicine.
Great, thank you.
We're nearing the end of the presentation now, so if nobody else has any other questions, and if you do, please interrupt me right now. Then I'm going to, I'll ask a little, like a closing question. You spoke a lot to the length of time that it takes when it's involved in this process. And I mean, the extensive amount of time and persistence that you need to get grant funding for the specific projects you need as an MD PhD. So a two-parted question, even though the first part, who knows, it might not even exist. I'm curious if you know the rate of burnout amongst MDs compared to MD PhDs, or just doctors who aren't in research as opposed to doctors who are in MD or DO PhD programs. And number two, what are some of the initiatives that medical schools, possibly UW, pose to combat that burnout?
Okay, well, first of all, there's burnout that occurs during medical school. And that's the part that I'm kind of more familiar with because I've seen it in some of my students. And, you know, UW has various programs where they try to identify students who are at risk of quitting or you know, having a mental health crisis or whatever because of the burnout. And so there are programs and support for doing things to combat that at the medical student level. I'm less familiar with what happens after medical school. I've seen burnout among my PhD colleagues, and I've seen burnout among physicians as well. They burn out for different reasons. but they get frustrated with their job. The nice thing about being an MD PhD is that if you get burned out on doing research, you can always go and see patients all the time. If you get burned out on, doing the same medical procedure all the time, you can cut back on your medical practice and spend more time on your research. You have more options, and I think that helps in combating burnout, because you can change what you're doing considerably without giving up on all that education that you got. And and I've seen MD PhDs go both ways, that they have difficulty getting their practice going, and they spend more time doing research, and then they have their frustrations with grants, and they go back to seeing more patients, and they can flip-flop whenever they want and however much they want, because they really have those options. So in terms of burnout, I think they have an advantage. Now, I do not know the statistics. I have to tell you that. I haven't looked that up. But at least among the ones I've known, they've taken advantage of the fact that they have options.
That's a great way to put that, because I think even at this stage, something I've experienced and something I think a lot of pre-meds experience is that if you get burned out with classes, with studying, and you're wondering, geez, why the hell am I doing this? Go and scribe, go and shadow, go back to your clinical job, or even your non-clinical experience, just being around people, and being around patients in particular. I mean, it's a nice reminder. It's a reminder of why you're doing it. So I couldn't have said it better for myself. Thank you for that response. And thank you for your time today as well. We really appreciate having you here at our meeting.
You're welcome. And if any of you have a specific question that you think of later, Andrew can give you my email address, and I'm happy to respond to those too.
I'd be honored to do that. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And so with that, guys, I'm going to reshare my slide.
Right, and I'm gonna say goodbye, and it's nice to meet you all.
Yeah, appreciate your time.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Can you see that, you guys? Or Michael, can you see that? Let's just do you. Awesome. Okay. So more on our next meeting. So we have an excellent speaker. You guys, we have an amazing speaker. So honestly, there's so many accolades that it would take me about like 5, maybe 6 slides to fit them all in, probably even more. But we have a general surgical specialist. Her story of getting into medicine, the persistence that she's had to get to where she is today, is really breathtaking. I highly recommend you guys tell your friends and you yourself, if you can make it live, because she's a really great speaker. She's met Teintze on a bunch of different things, from surgical training to the various medical mission trips she's been a part of, and so much more. So highly recommend you guys make it next week. It will be on Zoom as well again. And so you have you can do so in the comfort of your apartment or wherever you reside as well. Oh, there we go. And our parting message.
All right, guys, I'm going to be doing the parting message tonight. So here's our quote for today. Research is to see what everybody has seen and to think what nobody else has thought.
I like that. Great job, Michael Ward. All right, guys, have a great weekend. Sanitize your laptops. We appreciate your time and attendance today. And yeah, we will see you guys next week.